Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this pre-fiscal statement event, pre-mini budget event. Call it what you will. Let me start by saying a particular thanks to the Nuffield Foundation, who have once again supported our pre-budget work, which would normally be our green budget, which we will still be doing in October in advance of what we expect to be a proper budget later in the year. But particularly given that we are getting no OBR forecasts with tomorrow's statement, we thought it really quite important to be doing some pre-mini budget analysis. Not that it's likely to be all that mini. If, as expected, Mr. Kwarteng announces the reversal of the national insurance increases which have already happened, and the corporation tax increases which are due next year, this will actually, we think, be the biggest tax-cutting fiscal event since Nigel Lawson's budget of 1988. So it may not be a budget, but it's, in terms of tax cuts, going to be bigger than any budget for more than 30 years. And yet we have no OBR forecasts to go with it. And that's why today we're going to start with a presentation of our fiscal forecasts. And here I should say a particular thanks to Citi, with whom we are once again collaborating on our green budget for providing some of the underlying economic forecasts. But Isabel Stockton will present those, and you'll see how the economic forecasts feed into our view of what's happening fiscally. An awful lot has changed since March. We simply cannot rely on forecasts from the OBR back then. The economy is set to grow a lot more slowly than was expected back then. So even without tax cuts, it looks like the long-term deficit will be perhaps £40 billion higher than expected back then. And that's, by long-term, I mean after, hopefully, all of the energy support package has come to an end. Add another 30 billion of tax cuts, and as you'll see, we're expecting to end up with a deficit in 3 years' time around the 100 billion mark. And if that's where we end up, not only will that break the fiscal rules legislated just earlier this year, it will put debt on an unsustainable path. Now, of course, there's huge amounts of uncertainty about that, and if we do get the growth, big increase in growth the Prime Minister's been looking for, then all becomes easier. But there is no, to put it mildly, guarantee of that. What about the effects of those changes? Zhao Weizhu will follow Isabel with analysis of personal tax changes and their impact. And it's worth stressing that even if the national insurance increases are reversed, the freezing of income tax allowances will still mean a substantial tax rise over the next few years if they are indeed implemented. And of course, over the next couple of years, we're seeing a vast fiscal intervention in support of energy bills. I still think that the household announcement on energy bills a couple of weeks ago was possibly the single biggest fiscal statement, possibly since the last war. So expensive will it be. But even with this, as Zhao will show, most households are still going to be worse off this year than last. As we have said again and again, I'm afraid that the energy price shock has made us poorer, and we will be worse off. The government can spread the pain over time and between people, but in the end, it's not going to be able to magic it away. Finally, Stuart Adam will look at the other big expected announcement, the reversal of the corporation tax rise, which is due in April. And he'll also set out some of the other options for corporate tax reform and what we know about the potential consequences of not implementing that increases. Now, tax cuts, particularly perhaps corporate tax cuts, may increase growth in the short run. But it's worth stressing they can only be one small part of a growth strategy. And I guess where I end my introductory remarks here is that the Prime Minister's rhetoric around growth does make me hopeful that we will start to see something more solid in terms of further announcements, perhaps some tomorrow, perhaps more in the budget later this year, because the PM is absolutely right to want to focus on growth. So if, for example, we get a big cut in stamp duty tomorrow, as some have trailed, we will certainly be cheering that on. But I hope we also see a focus on, not over the next few months, all of those other things that we know are important for growth: tax reform, education, skills, planning, trade, infrastructure, and so on. Now, the Prime Minister has said that she doesn't mind taking unpopular decisions, and a lot of the decisions that she needs to take on, for example, planning reform and tax reform, and to some extent trade, infrastructure and education, may be difficult and unpopular. So I hope that she's willing to make those tough decisions, and good luck to her if she does. We will hopefully get some sense of further direction tomorrow. But with no further ado, let me pass over to Isabel, who will kick us off with a discussion of the public finance outlook. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. So as Paul mentioned, it's been a long 6 months since we've had official forecasts from the OBR. And so I'm going to tell you about our view of the outlook for the public finances and the underlying outlook for the economy, and how the government's plans, as currently stated, appear to be based on a gamble on growth that may or may not end up paying off. So if we cast our minds back to the last OBR forecast, in March, the OBR was expecting steady, if somewhat unimpressive, growth over the whole of the forecast period. That had all changed by last month in August, when the Bank of England forecast a prolonged and pretty severe recession. Now, since then, we've had the announcement of the energy price guarantee, providing very substantial support to both household finances and business finances. And that support is going to help make that recession shallower and less prolonged. However, under Citi's current forecast, we are still expecting to have quite a dreadful few years in terms of real economic growth in output. So that at the end of that period, in 2027, we would expect the real economy to be 5% smaller than it would have been under the OBR's March forecast. Now, changes to growth in real output are not the only thing, or even perhaps the main story of what's changed since March. We all know that we're expecting to see a lot more inflation. And what that inflation does is it cushions the hit to the nominal, the cash size of the economy. And the result of that is that in cash terms, we and Citi are expecting the economy to be only about 2% smaller by the end of the period than it would have been under the OBR's spring forecast. Now, why am I telling you about the cash size of the economy? Why would economists care about the cash size of anything? Well, we in particular care about the cash size of the economy because it matters for tax revenues. So tax liabilities are usually levied on cash quantities, things like profits, spending, earnings, and therefore nominal GDP matters more for revenues than real GDP does. And that cushioning effect that inflation has on the nominal size of the economy translates into a cushioning to the hit on revenues. Now, but that's not the only effect that inflation has on the public finances. We're also expecting to see substantially higher spending on debt interest into the future, as we already have been seeing in the last few months. And that is for multiple reasons. Now, about a quarter of the government's debt stock is index linked, which means that the cost of servicing that part of the debt goes up immediately or almost immediately when inflation rises. Now, that is a transitory effect. Once inflation comes back down, hopefully, then that cost will also pass. However, there is a more prolonged effect, and that is coming from higher interest rates. So both higher rates of bank rate and higher gilt rates. Now, another spending line that is directly affected by higher inflation is spending on pensions and on most working age benefits, which are uprated each year by the previous autumn's inflation numbers. So therefore, we are expecting to see a further increase on top of what was already an elevated spending forecast back in March. Now, in addition to all these automatic effects of higher inflation on the public finances, we've seen some really eye-catching, really substantial policy commitments. And you'll be hearing a lot more detail about those from my colleagues later on. But of course, I couldn't just be silent on the energy price guarantee. So this guarantee is going to have a cost that is large. It is ex ante, incredibly uncertain. And crucially, for our forecast, we assume it's completely temporary. So we assume that it costs well over 100 billion in the first 2 years, but nothing after that. Now, the government has also committed to substantial tax cuts that Paul has already mentioned. So reversing the recent rise in national insurance contributions and cancelling the planned large rise in the rate of corporation tax would cost us about £30 billion a year in lost revenue. And in fact, those policies are much more important for the medium and longer term health of the public finances than the energy price guarantee, which could turn out to be very costly, but is crucially a temporary measure, or at least intended as such. Now, just to be clear about the numbers I'm going to be showing you, there are quite a few policy ideas that are sort of floating around, but that we are not including. So some of those potential policies that are not in our forecasts are ideas such as bringing forward the planned cut to the basic rate of income tax, increasing defense spending to 3% of national income by the year 2030. So unless you're planning for a very steep increase indeed at the very end of the decade, you might think that we would need some extra spending towards that goal within the forecast horizon, or topping up departmental budgets. So previous IFS research has found that even to maintain the real terms generosity that was intended when those spending plans were set could cost about £18 billion a year for 2 years. So through all these effects, the automatic effects of inflation on spending as well as policy choices, we're expecting borrowing to be up substantially on the OBR forecast from March. So under that forecast, borrowing was set to fall over the period and to be running at just over £30 billion a year in the last year of the forecast. Now, if we look at our new forecast based on this current economic outlook, you can see incredibly high, although incredibly uncertain, borrowing numbers for the next 2 years, while we expect the energy price guarantee to be quite expensive. Now, I should stress that there are risks to those estimates to both sides. So it could turn out to be even more expensive. It could turn out to be much cheaper if energy prices don't go up as high as was forecast at the time of the announcements. But what's perhaps more important is that even after that temporary crisis intervention is assumed to have expired, we are still expecting to see borrowing to be up by more than £60 billion a year. And circa half of that increase is due to policy decisions, most of which are tax cuts. Now, in the last year of the forecast, you can see that we've got borrowing running at just over £100 billion. If the government, as it's planning to do, spends about 70 billion on investment, that would leave the current budget deficit at just over 30 billion pounds. Now, the currently legislated fiscal targets, which, as Paul said, were legislated just this past January, state that the current budget should be in balance or better, at least by the third year of the forecast, so that target would be missed. And if we think about the second main fiscal target that the government currently has, that one targets underlying debt. Underlying in this case means excluding the portion that is due to interventions by the Bank of England. And this underlying measure of debt under the OBR forecast was set to fall, albeit not particularly steeply, towards the end of the forecast horizon. And what we're expecting to happen now is a pretty sharp increase in the next couple of years, while the crisis intervention of the energy price guarantee is coming in very expensive, but an ongoing increase after that. So debt would be on an ever increasing path in the medium term. That would mean that the second main fiscal target would also be missed, and more importantly, looking beyond sort of the specific details of this particular set of fiscal targets, this is not a sustainable trajectory for the public finances to take in the long term. Now, of course, the elephant in the room here is growth. And of course, no one is going to argue with the fact that more growth would clearly help, would clearly make the trade-offs facing the Chancellor a lot easier. Now, just as a sort of thought experiment, if the government set itself the task to stabilize debt as a share of national income, that underlying measure of debt that I just showed you, even just at the very end of the forecast, they would need to achieve more than an extra 0.7 percentage points on growth every single year of the forecast going forward. And just to contextualize how big of an increase that would be, it's the difference between average growth of the UK economy, average real growth, in the 25 years before the financial crisis, which we generally think back to as a fairly economically healthy period, versus the period of the 2010s that included the austerity years, and we generally think back to as not a great era for growth. So if the government were to achieve this feat and get that extra growth, it would be either a stroke of extraordinarily good luck or a huge policy success. And if the government were to count on a strategy of mainly headline tax cuts to deliver that extra growth, well, we think that would be a gamble at best. And as Paul already alluded to, it's more likely to take a concerted effort of reform and investment across multiple areas of policy, including planning, tax design, education and skills, and so on. So let me conclude here and just quickly summarize. So I've shown you that we see a materially deteriorated outlook for the economy compared to the OBR's March forecast. The perhaps good news buried within the bad is that inflation cushions the hit to revenues. However, from a public finance point of view, that comes at the cost of spending plans for government departments that are now tighter than was intended at the time they were set. And the planned tax cuts that the government has promised will account for more than half the increase in borrowing compared to the OBR's March forecast in the medium term, so around the mid-2020s. That increase would be more than £60 billion under this current forecast in each of those three last forecast years. Under current investment plans, that would mean that we would be running a current budget deficit of around 1% of national income and have that on a rising path, even after the energy price guarantee is assumed to have expired. Those two things would mean that the main two fiscal targets that were legislated only in January would be missed, and missed by a fairly wide margin at that. And certainly more growth would help make these trade-offs a whole lot easier, but even just generating enough growth to stabilize debt, not a particularly ambitious objective, would be an ambitious policy goal. I will now hand over to my colleague Xiaowei, who will tell you more about policies affecting households.
Thanks, Isabel. Share my screen. So I'm going to talk about the outlook for households. There's been lots of speculation about what we'll hear tomorrow, but even before that, there's been a number of tax and benefit changes that have come in this fiscal year, as well as a rise in inflation and support packages that have been introduced in response to that. So in this presentation, I want to take you through both the changes affecting households that we already know about, as well as some of the big changes that we're expecting, to provide some context for tomorrow's announcements. Before Liz Truss took over as Prime Minister this month, the previous government had already planned a series of tax and benefit changes coming into force this year. These include a rise in the generosity of universal credit for working households, and also a rise in the threshold at which you start paying NICs. Offsetting these giveaways were a 1.25 percentage point rise in the rate of NICs, later to be termed the Health and Social Care Levy, as well as a freeze in income tax thresholds. On top of these more permanent changes to the tax and benefit system, the previous government also introduced a large package of support to help with the rising cost of living. These include things like the near universal offer of £550, additional support for target groups like household and means tested benefits, and a 5p cut to fuel duty. Now, if we look at the distributional impact of the changes that were introduced during the last government, we see that the permanent changes are clearly progressive. The rise in universal credit benefits lower income households, whereas the rise in income tax and NICs is mainly borne by higher income households. I should note here that I'm assuming that in the short run, the rise in employer NICs is borne by employers with no effect on wages. So here I'm really only capturing the rise in employee NICs. If we add on the effect of energy support packages, we'll see that the package is very large and also broadly progressive, with more cash going to lower income households. And taken together, the combined effect is to increase average household incomes by about £750 in cash terms, with larger increases for lower income households. Now, it's really important to stress that what I'm showing here is the cash effect of the policies. I'm not saying that households are £750 better off on average this year. Obviously, I'm not taking into account the massive increase in prices that households are facing, which the energy support package is a response to. So I think you can think of this chart as showing the cash effect on households relative to a counterfactual in which the government did nothing this year. And I'll talk about what happens to real living standards later on. Now, since Liz Truss became Prime Minister, she's introduced an energy price guarantee costing around 26 billion this fiscal year, so doubling the previous energy support package that was announced under Boris Johnson's government. And it's widely expected that tomorrow there will be a reversal of the next rise and a cancellation of the Health and Social Care Levy. We look at the distributional impact of those policies. We see that the cash effect of the energy price guarantee is large and roughly evenly spread across the income distribution. Reversing the next rise would lead to some small gains concentrated towards the top of the distribution. And taken together, low-income households would receive about £2,000 in cash terms, compared to a situation in which the government did nothing. And the cash effect would fall as we move up the distribution. For the highest income households, the temporary energy support and the reversal of the next rise would just offset the losses from tax rises announced under Boris Johnson's government. Now, as I tried to stress, this is not saying that low-income households are going to be £2,000 better off this year. So clearly the cash gain from the energy support measures is offsetting the fact that earnings are not keeping up with inflation, and benefits in particular were uprated by only 3% in April. So in this chart, I'm going to show how the incomes of different types of people are affected in real terms, taking into account the effect of much higher prices. And here I'm assuming that the next rise is reversed in January next year, as Isabel did in her presentation. In real terms, we expect the median earner to be around £500 worse off than they were last year, which is around a 3% cut in their net income. Higher earners, though not very high earners, would be more than £1,000 worse off, which is a larger increase in percentage terms. Low earners and those who are out of work would be more shielded from the rising cost of living, both in cash terms and as a share of income. Though I think what this chart really shows is that, you know, even after the government spending vast amounts of money to protect households from the rising cost of living, most households would still see their living standards fall this year compared to last year. So in the analysis, I've assumed that Liz Truss will reverse the NIC's rise, the rise in NIC's rates tomorrow, but she does have some options. So the simplest thing would be to go back to the previous rates, but there's a question of whether the rise in the NIC's threshold would be reversed as well, given that the threshold was raised to partly offset the increase in rates. Now, if she were to keep a higher threshold and cut the NIC's raise, that would obviously be a much larger cap in taxes. She could also choose to only reverse part of the rise. So, for example, only cut the rate below the upper earnings limit, and therefore make the cut a bit less regressive, or only cut the rate for employees and the self-employed, and therefore save some money. Now, Liz Truss has repeatedly said that she wanted to boost growth and use this NIC's cut as an example of boosting growth. I think, you know, it's likely that any tax cut would have some effect on employment and hours worked, but I think the effect of the cut is likely to be very small, and it certainly won't pay for itself. So one way of summarizing change in work incentives is to look at the effective marginal tax rate that workers face. And here, the average marginal tax rate faced by workers on average would fall by just 1 percentage point from 37%. So we wouldn't expect a very large labour supply response. The work incentive is even smaller for low-income workers, and that's because many don't earn enough to pay NICs to begin with, and many would also see the gains from the tax cut reduced by the universal credit taper. Looking beyond this fiscal year, Boris Johnson's government announced that income tax thresholds would remain frozen until 2025. Now, because of the high rates of inflation that we're seeing, this has ended up being a much bigger policy than was initially forecast. And based on the inflation figures, it's poised to raise nearly 4 times the 8 billion it was initially expected to raise. What this means is that the number of taxpayers and the number of high rate taxpayers will continue to rise over the Parliament. The share of adults who pay the higher rate of tax is expected to go up from 11% today to more than 14% in 2025. And had the threshold been uprated with inflation, as is the default, only 9% of adults would pay the higher rate of tax in 2025. Now, it's worth noting that that figure is lower than the figure today because earnings are not expected to keep up with inflation. The freeze to thresholds means that 7.7 million people will pay the higher rate of tax in 2025. That's 1 in 5 taxpayers, up from 6.1 million today. So in addition to freezing income tax threshold, the last government also planned to freeze the NIC's threshold and align it with the personal allowance, and also to reduce the basic rate of income tax by 1 percentage point from April 2024. The long-run impact of the tax and benefit measures introduced by the last government is a large tax rise, mainly borne by higher income households. Now, reversing the Health and Social Care Levy, which we expect to happen tomorrow, will dampen the impact of that. But the overall picture, as shown by those black diamonds, is still one of large progressive tax rises. So I think it's important to contextualize the effect of this particular policy in terms of what we've seen so far. The government has also suggested that it will cut stamp duty in tomorrow's announcement. It's given no details of what that will entail, so I can't give you any analysis, but I will try to provide a bit of context. So stamp duty is a large tax. It's forecast to raise 17 billion this financial year, and it's highly progressive. So the marginal tax rate rises steeply with house prices. But it's worth noting that relatively few transactions pay these very high rates of stamp duty. We've seen a huge increase in stamp duty over recent decades. So here I'm plotting the stamp duty payable on given house prices based on the 1997 tax schedule and the tax schedule we see today. And you see a massive rise. So for someone buying a property worth £500,000, the stamp duty payable has increased threefold since 1997. Now, stamp duty is a terrible tax. It raises the cost of moving home, which leads to an inefficient allocation of the housing stock. It leads to barriers in geographic mobility. So I think it's no bad thing to cut it. But the fact that it's highly progressive means that cutting stamp duty will benefit largely rich homeowners. So I think if the Prime Minister is thinking about a wider package of reforms to the tax system, this is a good time to make council tax more progressive and more in line with today's property values to offset some of the regressive effect of the stamp duty cut. So to conclude, there's been a huge package of support this year to deal with the rising cost of living, with Liz Truss doubling the support package that was announced under the previous government. The previous government introduced a large and progressive set of tax increases. And the reversal of the NICS rise will undo nearly half of that increase, but higher income households would still face a substantial tax rise after the cutting the NICS rate. It's worth noting that despite this massive package of support, we still expect to see a fall in living standards, with the median earner seeing around a 3% fall in real incomes. Thanks. So I'll pass on to Stuart, who will talk about the outlook for business and policies affecting businesses.
Thanks, Xiaowei. Good morning, everyone. So the big business tax change that we're expecting tomorrow is cancelling the corporation tax rise that's currently scheduled for next April. Now, that's a fairly hefty increase from 19% to 25% in the headline rate. But to put that into historical context, the rate would still be lower than it was in 2011, let alone the 52% rate that we saw through the 1970s and early 80s. But a rise in corporation tax would have been a big change in direction of travel, the first rise in the headline rate for half a century. And so in that sense, cancelling that increase would bring Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng back towards the pattern that we've seen over the past 50 years. Now, this chart only shows the main rate of corporation tax. It's important to emphasise that that doesn't apply to all profits. The rate isn't currently due to go up for small companies, those making relatively low profits. There's a separate regime for North Sea oil and gas, so that's of course now subject to a windfall tax for the next 3 years. And a different rate, a low 10% rate that applies to profits and patents, which isn't changing. Banks are subject to the main rate of corporation tax, but are also subject to a bank surcharge. And at the moment, when the main rate goes up, the bank surcharge is due to go down, so there's very little change in the rate that banks are facing. One side issue to look out for tomorrow is if, or more likely when, the rise in the rate is cancelled, will the corresponding cut to the bank surcharge be cancelled as well, or will that still go ahead? The existing official costings from the Treasury and the OBR imply a cost of cancelling the rate rise of about £15 billion a year in today's terms. Now, that explicitly includes effect of corporation tax rates on international profit shifting, but not the effect of corporation tax rates on investment. And we would expect a lower rate of corporation tax to lead to higher investment in the UK. And that means that the cost of cancelling the rate cut will be lower than the £15 billion official costing, but it would still be well above zero. It's just not true to say that a lower rate would mean higher revenue. There is still a cost to the exchequer of cancelling this corporation tax rise. So where do we stand internationally? Looking at headline rates of corporation tax across the OECD, the countries shaded in black here are the G7 countries. We can see the UK in yellow is, with a 19% rate, is among the lowest in the OECD. With a 25% rate, it would have been roughly middle of the pack, although still the lowest in the G7. The headline tax rate isn't the whole story. The UK looks less competitive internationally when you look at the whole corporation tax regime. And in particular, the UK taxes an unusually broad measure of profits. Allowances for investment in corporation tax are ungenerous by international standards. So if we look at capital allowances for an investment in machinery, for example, the UK at the moment has a temporary super deduction for 2 years, but that's due to expire in April. And once that does expire, the UK will have among the least generous tax allowances for investment in the developed world. So taking the UK's low headline tax rate and broad tax base together, the effective corporate tax rate in the UK actually are around the middle of the pack by international standards. Now, Rishi Sunak was well aware of this, and the spring statement suggested the possibility of increasing the UK's ungenerous capital allowances in April 2023, when the existing super deduction expires and the rise in the headline rate kicks in. And the Treasury issued a policy paper in May seeking views on various options for increasing capital allowances. So at some point, we're expecting the result of that consideration. And Rishi Sunak essentially argued in his May's lecture at the start of the year that increasing capital allowances is a better targeted policy at increasing UK investment than keeping a low headline rate of corporation tax. I think that proposition is debatable. In a domestic context, I think Rishi Sunak was exactly right. Capital allowances are more directly targeted at investment. The biggest gains from cutting the headline rate of corporation tax go to the most profitable companies who aren't necessarily investing a lot. And if their investments are highly profitable, those will be worthwhile and go ahead, even if tax is a bit higher. What you need to focus on is ensuring that those borderline investments that might be discouraged by tax aren't discouraged by tax, and capital allowances are a better way of achieving that than a lower headline rate. But in an international context, the story is a bit different, because maybe those highly profitable investments will go ahead anyway, but they won't necessarily go ahead in the UK. And so you might want a low headline tax rate on those profits to attract those highly profitable investments to the UK. So there's a genuine trade-off there between wanting to target, to make sure that those investments that may be discouraged by tax aren't discouraged by tax, versus making sure the UK is attractive for those highly profitable, highly mobile international investments. And in terms of the overall pros and cons, where the balance of that comes out, I think it's a genuinely close call. I think expert opinion on that would be divided. Now, it doesn't have to be an either-or choice. Does cancelling the rate rise next April mean that the Prime Minister and Chancellor will also abandon this idea of increasing capital allowances? In principle, they could do both, particularly given what they've been saying about wanting tax cuts to boost investment in the economy. More generous capital allowances for investment alongside keeping a lower corporation tax rate would be even more targeted at that. It would, of course, add further to the cost of the policy. So far, that doesn't seem to be something that bothers the Prime Minister and Chancellor very much, but we will see what the Chancellor has to say tomorrow. I think the broader point I would raise is that we should be looking for a more strategic plan for the structure of corporation tax than just whether the rate is higher or lower, whether a particular capital allowance for plant and machinery is higher or lower. We should be asking what kind of corporation tax we want, what's the right level for capital allowances, what are we trying to achieve, and trying to address other distortions in corporation tax to what assets people are incentivized to invest in terms of the bias between using debt versus equity to finance investment and so on, as well as just the level of investment. It's not just about more investment is better, it's also about what kinds of investment, as well as other objectives like keeping the tax system relatively simple. So much for corporation tax. There have been, of course, a whole bunch of other potential tax cuts that Liz Truss in particular has either said that she's potentially interested in or has been reported to be considering, from introducing low tax investment zones to reforming the IR35 rules as a tax stream to contractors and many more. Also, many on the personal tax side, of which Xiao Wei has mentioned one or two. So it'll be interesting to see whether we get a whole raft of additional tax measures tomorrow, or just confirmation of the things we know about. But rather than go through all of the possible things that the Chancellor could do and that have been speculated on, I just want to draw attention to one thing that I haven't seen much reporting on, but would be surprised if it didn't become an issue in the coming months, which is business rates. Because there are very big changes to tax bills due to come in next April. And there are particularly three things all happening at once. First of all, by default, business rates bill go up in line with inflation every April. Given where inflation is at the moment, that's potentially a 10% rise in average bills coming in next April. Second thing that's happening is a revaluation of business rates is due to take effect, bringing it up to date in terms of basing tax bills on more up-to-date estimates of property value than they currently are. That doesn't increase bills on its own or on average, but it means tax bills rising for some and falling for others, or in this case, rising more than 10% inflation for some and less than that for others. Those changes, the biggest changes, are phased in gradually, but there will still be some substantial changes coming in April. And then the third thing that's happening, it seems a long time ago now since we were talking about help for businesses during lockdown, but actually the last of the temporary business rate relief is still in place for retail and hospitality firms and is due to come to an end in April. So taking those three things together, there will be quite a lot of firms potentially facing really big rises in business rates bills next April. And I wonder whether the Chancellor will really allow that to happen. Now, of course, he doesn't have to announce that something on that tomorrow, particularly if there is going to be another official budget before the end of the year, but he could take this opportunity to say something about what might happen to business rates next April. So, to sum up, the main thing that we're expecting on business taxes tomorrow is cancelling what would have been the first rise in the headline rate of corporation tax for half a century. That will reduce tax revenue, but by less than the official figures might suggest. The Chancellor might want to find some money to ease business rate changes due next April, or he doesn't have to do that tomorrow if he does it at all. And I say there may or may not then be a whole raft of other announcements, and I'm happy to talk about people's favourite options in the Q&A, but now I will hand back to chair that.
Thank you very much indeed to Stuart, to Xiaowei, and to Isabel. I should have said in my introduction that if you want to ask questions, please put them in the Slido link, which you should have received. We've got quite a few already. If you like any of them, do vote them up, because I will see the ones at the top first. I also note, actually, question on Twitter from which I'm going to start with, actually, from Judith Friedman, who has made the point that we have not acknowledged the difference between the temporary increase in national insurance contributions and the introduction of the health and social care levy as of next April. And that's entirely my fault, because I suggested to Xiaowei that might be one piece of detail too much to put in the presentation, but as Judith says, it is an important distinction because of the change in the base. So Xiaowei, could you just say a word or two about that distinction between the reversal of the national insurance increase and the possibility that whilst that may happen, we may still get a health and social care levy?
Yeah, I think that is a very good point. So there is, as Judith said, a difference in the two taxes, given that NICS doesn't apply to workers above the state pension age, whereas the health and social care levy would apply to older workers as well. So if there were a cut to NICS and the health and social care levy went ahead as planned, that would essentially increase taxes on older workers. That would be quite a strange thing to do in today's labour market, given that we know that there's been a huge exodus of older workers from the labour force altogether. So further disincentives for them to work would not be advisable, especially since this group is, quite sensitive to changes to taxes. So there's absolutely a difference. So when I talked about reversing the NICS cut, I sort of assumed that that would mean reversing the NICS cut this year, or in this fiscal year, and a cancellation of the health and social care levy going forward. I guess there's also a political difference in having a separate tax that's said to fund social care and health and social care, which I guess allows for the prospect of raising this tax in the future.
Yeah, I think that's that is an interesting distinction. It would be, in a sense, it would be slightly odd to reverse the national insurance increase and then introduce the health and social care levy, presumably with a further reduction in national insurance to offset it. So you would end up with roughly the same amount of tax being raised, but a new tax called the health and social care levy. On the other hand, because the health and social care levy is levied on various forms of dividend and other income, it would be different, would raise a little bit more and have a slightly different impact on slightly different people. It would, as Xiaowei also suggests, offer even if not much extra money in the short run, offers the opportunity of a new tax to be raised further into the future. There's a question here which is second on the list. Is there any indication of how the government hopes to fund reforms to adult social care without the health and social care levy? Well, I think the answer to that is in the short run through additional borrowing, as we've described. Part of the answer is also, of course, that whilst the health and social care levy was supposed to be targeted specifically at increasing spending on health and social care, of course, there is that kind of hypothecation never really happens, and I think we will see that very clearly, that we will presumably abolish the health and social care levy, but we will not be changing or cutting, at least, intended spending on health and social care. Hypothecation of that kind is always a question of smoke and mirrors, but the question relates to the broader issue of, if you are overall cutting tax revenues, how are you going to fund spending in the future, which certainly in the short run looks like more borrowing, and in the long run, I suspect means more tax may be raised in different ways and maybe not raised for another few years. But unless we're going to have cuts overall in public spending, inevitably it means higher taxes at some point. Right at the top of the pops on Slido is a nice, interesting question. What are the implications of Friday's fiscal event for the standing of the OBR, given it has not been able to undertake an assessment of the Chancellor's measures? It may be that one of my colleagues wants to come in on that as well, but let me say two things about that. I mean, the first is that the OBR is it's worth saying that we have had an awful lot of fiscal events over the last 3 years, as Mr. Sunak and Mr. Johnson have come to Parliament with fiscal statements right the way through COVID. Last September with the introduction of the Health and Social Care Levy, in May with part of the energy package that Xiaowei talked about. And we didn't, in fact, get OBR forecasts alongside those. So you could say that this isn't so different. On the other hand, this is different in the sense of scale. This is a potentially huge change. Clearly, we've had a very big change in the economic situation. And this is not a sort of emergency response to COVID or indeed energy prices to the extent that we're looking at cuts to NI and corporation tax. So it is different in that sense. My guess, nevertheless, is that we will have the OBR producing its forecast later this year alongside a budget, and then in March alongside a spring statement. And I'm not desperately worried in that sense about the ongoing standing of the OBR. But Isabel Stewart Xiaowei, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that I think another conclusion we could draw from looking at the pandemic period is that the OBR can and do publish analysis outside of their regular economic and fiscal outlook publications with a budget or with a spring or autumn statement. So they did that during the first summer of COVID, where they did some incredibly valuable scenario analysis. So I have faith that they're able to help us with their analysis, even when not particularly asked to produce the EFO at any particular moment in time.
Excellent. So we still have faith. I think the conclusion is it would have been good to have had an OBR forecast this time round, but not yet time to panic about the future of the OBR and its role. So there's another question here. If the government were to fund tax cut policies through spending cuts to Department, what level of reduction to public spending would be required? The answer to that is an awful lot. As Isabel has already spelled out, you would need to increase spending by, we think, perhaps 18 billion a year just to offset the impacts of additional inflation, since spending totals were set out a year ago. And even within that wouldn't be giving you inflation matching increases in public sector pay. So we're already 18 billion down. And clearly, if tax revenues, if the tax cuts are 30 billion, if you wanted to pay for those through spending cuts, that's another 30 billion. I think in a sense it's an academic question. I may have this wrong, but it seems to me implausible that we're going to see cuts to public service spending over the next couple of years, partly because, as I say, the real level of public service spending is already going to be significantly down on what was intended. And you don't have to look very hard to see that most of the public sector is not awash with money. We're seeing way below inflation pay rises right across the public sector. We've got announcements today around the health service, which is clearly struggling. Barristers are on strike over cuts to the justice budget. and so on, and so on. Again, sorry, I don't mean to hog this. Would any of my colleagues like to come in additionally on that? No. So Jack Barnett is asking if reversing the corporation tax rise and the NI rise will put debt on an unsustainable path, what would be a better alternative? Would boosting investment tax relief be more effective at lifting productivity and growth? Stuart, do you want to expand a little on what you've said about the optimal mix of corporate tax policy to turbocharge growth?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I'd start with a much broader picture. So, as you said in the introduction, Paul, a lot of the most important things you can do for growth aren't about the tax system. There are all sorts of other things in terms of planning reform, education and skills, and so on, that might be important for growth. Even within the tax system, first of all, it's not all about corporate tax. Also, there isn't going to be one magic bullet that would make an enormous difference. There's really accumulation of a lot of smaller reforms, structural reforms that might each make a smaller difference and add up to quite a lot. So within corporation tax, one thing I mentioned is, as I said, the distortion between different forms of investment, different financing investments, the fact that at the moment we already subsidise a lot of debt financed investment. It's not obvious that we actually want to be subsidising that further through just increasing capital allowances, for example. And so evening out the treatment of debt and equity, evening out the treatment of different assets would help in that respect. Actually, a lot of the things I point to on tax and growth are perhaps less obvious things and things that are outside the obvious realms of corporation tax and investment. One thing is the way that business rates treats new investments. A second might be actually if you look at the area of environmental taxation and the way we get to net zero. Tax is one part of that mix, but what you do with that mix could have a real impact on the economic cost of getting to net zero. Of course, big benefits if you succeed in reducing global emissions as well. Things like using more congestion charging in place of fuel duties. Actually, people forget just how much people's productive time is wasted sitting in traffic jams. That could make a significant difference. Slightly more obscure thing, the VAT treatment of financial services is a personal bugbear of mine, could do with some fairly major reform. There's a whole load of things across different parts of the tax system that if you could take a serious look at, incrementally, a lot of these things could make a small difference a bit at a time. There's not going to be one magic bullet. And I think one area in which some of the commentary I've seen in recent days, I think, is a bit unfair, is that you can always look at one policy and say, that's not going to transform the UK's growth prospects. And that's always going to be true. But it's a question of taking a serious, holistic look at policy across the board and at how all of the different policy areas fit together. And that's certainly more complicated than just saying we need to cut headline tax rates to boost growth.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come to you again, Stuart. I mean, just to reiterate what Stuart said there about growth. Growth policy requires a whole slew of coordinated policy action, some of which complex, some of which unpopular, but all of which important. And given that, as I believe that tomorrow's statement is being advertised by the Treasury as a plan for growth, it will be very good to see if we do get something along those lines. I'm going to come to you again, Stuart, because there's a couple of related questions here, particularly around these so-called or proposed investment zones, which I think you've also been thinking about, and not least in the context of the current free ports policy. And any insight into what these things might be and what we know about how impactful or effective such zones might be?
Yeah, so obviously we don't know exactly what would be contained in any particular announcement for investment zones. The idea is essentially that you designate some bit of the country and say we are going to have particularly investment-friendly or growth-friendly policies in those areas. So that may include tax breaks. It may also include more relaxed regulations, more investment in infrastructure. The exact content of them can vary. We've sort of got that at the moment in terms of free ports. It was interesting during the leadership campaign was to deepen free ports and make them properly low tax zones, which I found pretty remarkable when you look at the tax advantages that free ports are already getting in terms of no employer nicks under a cap, no tax breaks on business investment, more generous capital allowances, there's stamp duty exemptions, there's a whole range of tax breaks. So if we're talking about something deeper than that, then we're potentially looking at something really quite big. Now, and the effect they have will somewhat depend on the exact nature of the policy, which we don't know yet, and of course the scale of the policy, we don't know yet. Would this be one or two small areas, or would this end up being half the country? Broadly speaking, what we've tended to find from past policies like this around the world is that they don't do a huge amount to increase investment and economic activity overall. What they mainly do is displace economic activity from other areas of the country to these investment zones or enterprise zones or free ports or whatever that may be. And other things being equal, I'd say, well, it's not obvious that we want to distort people's choices in that way. Why do we want to pay people to go and locate their business in one area rather than another? Oddly enough, I guess one reason you might argue in favour of that is as part of a levelling up type agenda, if you think that we want to start encouraging economic activity to shift to certain more deprived areas of the country. Again, whether that's the right kind of way we want to help those areas, I think is a more open question. But in that sense, I'd oddly enough think of it as more along the Johnson-Sunak agenda type lines of a levelling up type policy rather than a Truss-Kwarteng type lines of a growth agenda for the UK as a whole.
Thank you. As ever, great insight from Stuart on a lot of this. The whole slew of different sorts of questions here. It looks like a couple of the people watching are hoping to move house soon. So I think in answer to the question, how quickly would stamp duty changes come in, is I can only say I hope that they would come in almost immediately, because I think if you're going to announce a cut in stamp duty for the future, then the main effect of that will be to gum up the housing market completely between now and the future date at which the cut is announced. So I would hope if there is a change to stamp duty, we do not get something which says, and from next April, we will cut stamp duty dramatically, because the consequence will be nobody moving house between now and next April. So I think that's the sort of thing that would happen very quickly, I hope. There's also questions about how quickly a national insurance change could be introduced. Now, I think the best guide we have to that is that the cut to national insurance through an increase in the allowance, which was announced in March, didn't happen until July. But Xiaowei or Stuart, do we know whether they could change the rate any more quickly than that?
No, as far as I'm aware, the general thinking is that you need roughly a 3-month lead time, so we would be talking about something like January as the earliest. Actually, if anything, it would seem to me that it's likely to be more complicated to do it at, in a short space of time, say 3 months, for this change than it was for the threshold in April, actually because of what you would do with the self-employed who pay national insurance on an annual basis. So it's a bit harder to change their national insurance midway through the year, and particularly toward the end of the tax year. Actually, when they announced the threshold increase in the March spring statement, they brought it in July for employees because that's the quickest they could do it. But for the self-employed, it took effect immediately from April because they were paying tax over the whole fiscal year, so you could set the annual system. So I'd be surprised if you could do it much before January. I think in many ways it will be simpler just to wait for next April, just repeal the health and social care levy and let it happen automatically. You could probably do it quicker than that, but it would be a bit more complicated.
Still quite a range of questions here. Keep them coming. Right at the top is one I'm not sure we can say very much about, which is our view of the independence of the Bank of England under a Truss premiership. I think it's highly unlikely that that will genuinely be challenged. We clearly, if the government wants growth, the most important, I mean, literally the most important underlying requisite for growth is for political and economic stability and trust in political and economic institutions. One of the things that I think has been behind the slide in the pound over recent months and reductions in international investment in the UK has been concern about that political and macroeconomic stability. And anything that was seen to undermine the independence of the Bank of England would add to that perception. So if the government is, as I think it is, serious about growth first and foremost as a policy aim, then I would trust that there will be no attempt to do anything that would undermine the independence of the Bank of England, because I think that would make growth dramatically more difficult to achieve. Several questions about local government. I don't know, Isabel, whether you have anything to add about whether we're expecting anything that will impact on local government from tomorrow's event, or whether this is something we think that will be left for the future.
Not particularly, although, yeah, we have other colleagues not on the line who would be the best people to ask about that. But I don't have anything specifically to look out for.
I think it's fair to. I think it'll be a surprise if there was a lot for local government there. As someone else has suggested, it is time we got the fair funding review sorted out. But to be fair to the new Chancellor, he's only been in place for 2 weeks. So having chance to announce a lot of additional stuff, I think, is probably unlikely. I mean, on the tax side, Stuart, you've mentioned business rates, which are at least tangentially related to local government, but there's also a question here about likelihood of reform to council tax. I don't know whether you want to say any more about to develop what you were saying about business rates and also to speculate about council tax.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to say I see a reform of council tax coming around the corner. There certainly should be. I mean, you know, if nothing else, it is increasingly ridiculous that we still base council tax bills on relative property prices in 1991. Sadly, I don't see very much indication of that happening, but I plead to be proven wrong on that. And to be fair, there's slightly more promising signs in Wales, where they are actually looking and indeed moving seriously towards a proper reform and updating and rationalisation of council tax. There were small tweaks happened in Scotland a few years ago. So, you know, it is possible to change council tax. I really hope that England follows suit. And actually, if you are going to introduce cuts to stamp duties, linking that to a change in council tax would actually be a very nice way of doing it and have lots of advantages. but I'm not holding my breath to hear anything on that tomorrow.
There's a question here about whether the government has sufficient reliable access to proper analysis, even without the OBR, or are they flying blind? I don't think they're flying blind. I think they've got a reasonable amount of analysis. They will have a pretty good idea of what the OBR's forecasts are. They will have their own forecasts. As a sort of separate point, I think there is some concern in my mind about the lack of balance between the amount of economic analysis and expertise that the Treasury and indeed the OBR have access to relative to the bank. The bank has multiple numbers of economists working on the state of the economy and various aspects of it relative to what both the numbers and to some extent the seniority and expertise that you get at the Treasury. So I don't think in the short run, I don't think the Treasury has got any less access to expertise and forecast than it would normally. I think there is a broader structural question as to whether it has enough in general. It's a remarkably lean outfit when it comes to the amount of economic forecasting and other expertise that it has. Now, where should we go next? Well, is a reopening of departmental budget settlements inevitable given the impact of inflation? I think it is, but I have been proved wrong on this before. So to repeat, to extend what I said earlier and what Isabel said earlier, the real value of departmental settlements is over the next couple of years going to be a good 18 billion less than was intended a year ago. We're seeing pay rises across the public sector of around 5%, which compares with private sector increases of somewhat more than that, and inflation of 10%. It seems to me implausible that we're going to continue to be able to give public sector workers substantially below inflation pay rises. And again, to repeat, the pressures that we're seeing right across public services are not going to diminish. We've got an election coming up in 2 years. Despite the new Prime Minister's clear desire for a smaller state, I think it's going to be quite difficult for them to get through to the next election without reopening at least some departmental spending totals. Isabel, have you anything to add to that?
I think maybe just picking up on that point you just made, even if one had a desire for a smaller state in general or for a smaller public service in any particular area, which may be a political position that some people take, then I think we would always argue that it's better to make these cuts transparently and on purpose. And it's not clear that what you would want to do is to make cuts that depend on sort of what proportion of each department's budget is spent on fuel and heating. That seems a very strange way to determine what you think the allocation of resources across government departments should be. So at the very least, it's a slightly random and not very transparent way of making cuts.
Very well said. I think transparent and on purpose are quite good things for any policy change, and it's a general concern about policies whose effect really depends on the inflation rate that I think we have rather generally. So Xiaowei talked about the impact of the personal allowance and tax thresholds going up, being frozen, which now looks like a 4 times bigger policy than it looked like when that was first introduced. We've also seen over recent years freezing of welfare benefits, the impact of which was again dependent on inflation. So transparent and on purpose would be nice. What are the consequences of the government missing a legislated fiscal target? What actually happens? Well, I don't think anyone goes to prison. I think there's a deeper issue here about the extent to which we have now got to the point where fiscal targets have been missed and changed so frequently that if they ever had any real power to persuade people that this is a serious constraint on policy, I think they may be losing that. Isabel, can you remember how many targets have been missed in recent years? We did top them up recently, didn't we?
Yeah, we had, it used to be that we had 2 for 11 years and then 11 over the next 11 years, but I think we've now gone through more. And obviously whether we're meeting them or missing them changes rapidly. But as you say, the consequences become smaller and fewer the more often they're changed. Oh. And so I saw someone else asked, are we likely to see another change to the fiscal targets, either in this statement or in the autumn budget? And they really, whatever your views on what the right set of fiscal targets is, it's definitely not optimal to have them changing so frequently.
Yes, I think I think that is, we've had so many changes that they really are beginning to lose their power. Although, it's worth saying that a large part of the power or importance of fiscal targets are about sort of keeping other ministers in order. So every spending minister generally wants more spending, and having some limit on what can be spent is a key part of having a fiscal target. But when you've got a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who have in any case tied themselves very closely to the idea that they are looking for a smaller state, then that can itself have quite a significant effect on the spending side. Clearly, they are going to struggle to achieve that, as we've discussed, and they're cutting taxes. So what any future fiscal framework might look like, I'm not sure. It will presumably be looking further into the future, talking about debt going down into the longer term, but being relatively sanguine about debt rising in the short run, because Mr. Kwarteng and Ms. Truss believe that is what will get them growth further down the road. Where are we now? We've got several questions about growth, which I think we broadly covered. We've got questions about whether tax cuts pay for themselves, which again, I think we broadly covered. I think the answer to that is no, they might be a good thing, but they don't pay for themselves. Do we expect any changes to pension taxation? I think not tomorrow would be my guess. Who knows whether we'll get something in the budget further later in the year. It's worth saying on pension taxation and many other things that inflation again is having a big effect here. The amount that you can put into a pension, or indeed the amount that you can put into an ISA, are fixed at £40,000 a year for pensions, 20,000 for ISAs. Prices will have risen by about 25% between 2021 and 2024, reducing the real value of those allowances by 25% over a 3-year period, as it were, accidentally, not on purpose and not transparently, will actually have a big effect on the overall tax strategy for savings in this case, in particular. Stuart, you've thought an awful lot about the taxation of savings and pensions. Do you want to add anything on that topic?
No, I mean, I could talk for hours about it. I'm not sure if there's anything specific that I want to say at the moment. I think one thing I would just add, though, to what you were saying before about do tax cuts pay for themselves? I mean, I would say it is possible sometimes that they can. I think the two big tax cuts we're talking about tomorrow, reversing the national insurance rise and cancelling the corporation tax rise, there's almost no chance that they will pay for themselves. But for example, we were talking about stamp duty. The government's own estimate is that the top rate of stamp duty, the 12% rate, is already at about the revenue maximising rate. It may in fact be above the revenue maximising rate. It is plausible that cutting that would slightly increase revenue. I mean, or it could reduce it. There are other cases like that, but the kind of the big picture main ones we have is that, you know, for the most part, they won't, but you do have to assess each case on an individual basis.
Great. I think we're probably coming to the end of our session. Xiaowei, Isabel, Stuart, you can see all of the, I mean, there are far too many questions to go through all of them. Many of them actually we've covered in one way or another thus far. I'm going to ask each of my colleagues whether there's anything that they want to add, either in response to questions in Slido or because they feel we've missed it out. And I think we'll then bring the session to a close. Xiaowei, not many of these questions have been aimed at you, so I'll give you first shot at whether there's anything you'd like to add to what you've said or add to any of the questions that do remain.
Oh dear, I don't actually have that much to add to any of these questions.
Absolutely fine. No problem.
I might pass and maybe come back to it.
No problem at all. Isabel?
I unfortunately have no insight on forthcoming ONS classification decisions around the energy price guarantee, but it sounds like the sort of thing that might be keeping us busy for in a lot of time in the next 2 years. So yeah, looking forward to discussing it more in future events.
Stuart?
Well, I've already talked a lot, so maybe I won't say too much. I guess one thing I will pick up on from Slido is Heather Self's comment that a new business tax roadmap might be welcome and stability is important. Yes, I would absolutely echo that. And of course, with the business tax roadmap, it depends what it looks like. We had one in 2010 that was actually very sensible, very helpful. We had one a few years later that was really not worth the paper it was written on. So it has to be a meaningful and useful roadmap. But some sense of direction where we're going is useful. And as Heather says, some stability would also be useful. Constant revolution is not what we want in a tax system, though there are certainly welcome reforms that we could introduce. I'll stop there.
Last chance, shall we?
Yeah, I think I'd massively agree with what Stuart said. Some form of stability is important for growth, it's important for investment, and that's not just stability in the tax system, but stability in policy priorities overall. We've had, a number of changes in government since 2016, and lots of different directions of policy, scrapping of various industrial strategies, a new levelling up strategy, and now, a sort of lack of clarity of whether that's still a government priority. So I think, some sort of stability in government priorities would be important going forward.
Wouldn't that be nice? Look, thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Xiaowei. Thank you, Stuart, for really fantastic and insightful presentations and answers to a lot of questions. Thank you, everyone, for listening. As I said at the beginning, the main reason that we did this, we don't normally do an event like this the day before a budget or fiscal event, is because the OBR is not putting out its own analysis. Also because the event tomorrow is on Friday, and we're not therefore going to be holding a big event the morning after. So hopefully everyone listening has found this helpful and informative. We wait to see what actually will be in tomorrow's statement. We will obviously be responding as quickly and as fully as we can. But I think it's also worth saying that whatever we see in tomorrow's statement, it is still not a full budget. There is no way that a full budget could have been prepared in the time that we've had. So we are expecting, I think, a full budget later in the year. We have our own green budget event, in other words, our sort of a proper pre-budget event as opposed to pre-fiscal statement event cobbled together rather quickly. We've got that on the 11th of October, so please do come along to that. And as I say, look out for everything we're going to put out over the next 36 hours or so. And I'm expecting quite a lot more to analyse over the coming months. So thank you, everybody, very much indeed. Over the coming months. So thank you, everybody, very much indeed.